Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the things we left out, the stuff we got wrong, and where I try and fit a giant gold YouTube plaque into a Hong Kong apartment. Why you so big, YouTube plaque? You are already so gold. You do not need to be so big as well. I'm Rob, I'm the head writer of Extra History, and today we're talking about Nazi occultism. First of all, I wanted to thank our patrons for suggesting and voting for this topic. It's a really interesting one to cover. If you would like to be a patron, then there's a link to our Patreon. You can get episodes early. You can have a hand in shaping our future series by suggesting and voting for topics. And thank you again so much. I really believe Lies is an important part of this show, so thanks. We're part of the Nebula First program. You can go over there and see our first episode on our Posse conspiracy series. It's really great, involving some of my favorite historical characters. Recommended reading for this series is Hitler's Monsters, A Supernatural History of the Third Reich by Eric Kurlander. This is a really great book. It's the most recent, most scholarly, rigorous text on this topic. Dr. Kurlander reached out to me while we were doing the series. Thank you if you're watching. I really highly recommend checking it out. There's so much more to read about this topic. It's a huge landmark book, very well reviewed. And it's a good read. It's weighty. Also, Hitler, a biography by Ian Kershaw. This is one of the more recent biographies. It's very important if you want to understand things like the concept of working toward the Führer, of doing things that you think Hitler would want done, not necessarily being ordered to do them, but just doing them because that's like Hitler's vibe, basically. And how you sometimes had these decentralized little projects people had that came under the Nazi banner, but maybe were not specifically ordered from a top-down basis. The Master Plan, Himmler's Scholars in the Holocaust by Heather Pringle. This is everything you'd want to know about the Ahnenerbe. It's a very good book. Hitler Ascent, 1889 to 1939 by Volker Ulrich. I wanted to add this one in because I think while not too much of it was directly used for the series, I think it's important when you get into kind of like Hitler's mental state and the sort of operator he was politically. I think it helps things snap into focus. And one of the things that this really hammers on is the idea of Hitler is just a liar. And this is one of the reasons that it's so difficult to grapple with him. And what he believed personally is he would say completely different things to different people. So I really think this is a great book for getting into that question and understanding why, when we talk about something like, we'll talk about Hitler's religiosity and why that's such a difficult thing to grapple with. And there's a bunch of different articles in the description as well. The links to all this can be found in the description. Are we going to talk about the election and parallels? No. There's a couple reasons for that. I really deeply believe that I want to present the history and let people feel like, use it themselves how they think it is applicable to the current moment. I think that is a actually better way of, I think it's honestly a more honest and a better way of getting people to take it and apply it to our current moment. Also, I'm a little allergic to parallels, direct parallels, because I don't think that they have that much applicability. You know, like 1930s Germany is very different from modern America. So we have a question later on where we talk about sort of the genocide of Native Americans versus genocide in Germany. I feel like those are two very different things, that they share some commonalities, absolutely. And you can draw parallels, but it's different contexts, it's different times. Having said that, that doesn't mean that history doesn't have applicability to our current moment. It does, but you know, it's not necessarily a one-to-one thing. So that's why I'm not going to get so into that. But I think we all need to think about, and not just in our current moment, but in when we look at the past, how beliefs that are clearly untrue and things like conspiracy theories have shaped our past. Because, you know, the U.S. Civil War, the beginning of the Civil War is just steeped in conspiracy theories. And it's, you know, one of the things that drives on the secession crisis. And I think that one positive aspect and there are not that many, of kind of our disinformation environment and disinformation-soaked environment now, is we're starting to look back and say, like, maybe this actually played a bigger role in past events than we've given it credit for, which I've thought for a long time, because I've always been interested in this kind of stuff. But I feel like the conversation is turning to that a little more. Just to address a whole lot of questions, we didn't use the swastika in this series. We didn't use Nazi flags. This is part of a long-standing policy we've had. It's to protect us from demonetization. It's to protect our German viewers from being able to see it. There's very tight restrictions on how you can use Nazi imagery in Germany. And we didn't want to put anything up that will possibly cut people's access, even if wrongly. Because sometimes when that flip gets switched, it's hard to get it unswitched, right? If something is demonetized, it's very difficult to go the other way. And so we even made, long before I joined the channel, actually, we made a video about our policy on this. So it makes it very awkward sometimes when we're talking about like the history of the swastika, and it's one of the reasons I didn't want to get too far into the history of the swastikas. We knew that visually it's difficult to depict on YouTube and it's risky. I don't love that. We just kind of have to live with it. Episode 1, patron question from Alvarant. What's your justification for saying Hitler was an atheist? In Mein Kampf, he praises God 19 times. He shut down the German Freethinkers League in 1933 and assured the public his movement was Christian. The SS forbid atheists from joining and required its members to be Christian. There were swastikas with God mit uns, God's with us on them. These were actually on the belt buckles worn by German soldiers. So, as I alluded to, Hitler's personal religious beliefs or lack thereof are a real hot topic. They're very heavily debated among historians. Generally, like, to have some kind of consensus, he was very hostile to particularly institutional Christianity. And generally people feel that he was not a Christian. He was baptized Catholic. You know, Austria, if you've ever been to Austria, even today is super Catholic. He was baptized Catholic. He never renounced baptism. So on paper, he was Catholic, but he didn't really attend church after he was about 18 years old. As we mentioned in our World War I Christmas Truce series, he would opt out of even things like Christmas Eve services. Privately, he denigrated Christianity quite a bit and kind of intimated that in the future, when we solve these political problems and international crises, there's going to be a standoff with, the church, and we're going to try and do something about Christianity in Germany and Austria. In general, he didn't like anything that stood up to the power of the state. And there was this like state-church clash, but he clearly didn't feel like he could really devote a lot of political capital to it because Germany, at the time, and Austria were very heavily Christian. Like, Austria was very Catholic, and Germany was like a mix of Catholic and Protestant. He praised Luther quite a bit, but, Luther was also kind of seen as this nationalist hero. He wasn't necessarily only a Christian figure, right? You can go back and forth. Even people that were close to Hitler and had worked with him wrote books after the war that, it was sort of unclear, like they came to different personal opinions about like what his religious beliefs were. I think he was kind of functionally atheist, though that doesn't necessarily mean the same things in the 30s and 40s as it does now. He clearly believed in like some kind of spiritual dimension. Like when assassination attempts against him failed, he would talk about like Providence intervened, and I'm like I'm an instrument of Providence. But he was pretty critical of Christianity. But he also was happy to harness it. And during periods, Nazis were very extreme, but there were periods where they tried to appear more moderate and more acceptable. And in that time, there was a lot of signaling to German Christians and Austrian Christians that this was like a movement that they could be a part of. And of course, Christianity was kind of held in opposition to Judaism. So like the idea of like you being a Christian meant you weren't Jewish. We'll get to that in a later question. So I think he pragmatically used Christianity as a tool, but personally did not really believe in it. Patron question from Bo Carey. Can you tell us what the original meaning of the swastika is from Eastern religions? There's a number of meanings. In general, it's sort of like good fortune, prosperity, but actually it's a very widely used symbol. It's in the Mediterranean. It's in Byzantine art. It has different meanings depending on where you are, if it's running clockwise or counterclockwise. In Hinduism, it's generally associated with the sun as like a sun symbol. In Buddhism, it can represent the footprints of the Buddha. If you go to the reclining Buddha in Bangkok, their swastika is on his feet. Also along with like these really cool mother of pearl inlays about the life of the Buddha and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very widely dispersed and widely interpreted symbol. I kind of wanted to get into that, but I knew it was going to be iffy to depict, and I thought it might be awkward if we continued to do it. Patron question from Bo Carey. This is probably a weird question, but when you described how superstition mythologizing is what made Nazis' scientific research fall behind and hindered it, how come superstition didn't affect research, cultural, medical, and scientific advancements in civilizations throughout history? Can you elaborate and explain why? It absolutely did. The one example that springs to mind, because I've done a lot of medical history stuff, is the Christian belief about the resurrection of the body and Christian beliefs about how bodies should be as whole as possible when buried. That really, really held back medical science and in Europe for quite a long time, for centuries, because it was people were not allowed to do dissections of the dead, right? Like people would literally, like doctors would cut apart pigs to learn about human anatomy. And there's just not a very good understanding of the interior of the human body for a long, long time. And, you get the Renaissance where people are secretly doing dissections. You have, this becomes huge in the 18th century, because by the 18th century, the medical establishment has basically been like, no, actually we need to do this to figure out what's going on inside the human body. Benjamin Franklin kind of famously recently, we found out that when he was in London, he was doing like dissections in his basement. But like the procurement of these cadavers was illegal. And until the Anatomy Act, where like if you're executed for murder in England, you're handed over to a group of surgeons who publicly dissect you, both for medical science, but also as kind of like a form of punishment, spiritual punishment. So that, for example, held it back quite a bit. What's specific about Germany is, and what's unusual about it being in the 20th century in particular, and it hurt its scientific prowess in that, one, driving Jewish academics out and not using their work, two, aligning their politics against the university and academics in general, giving scientists not as much of a role in government, three, rejecting any findings that ran counter to the party line or were discovered by researchers they didn't like. So that, in my opinion, especially as part of the nuclear program, really hobbled their scientific advancement. There are very impressive engineering feats, right? Engineering is like, it's a little more practical. You don't run into as many political issues with it. So you do have like, tank designs and designs of rifles and things like that. I think that it really did hobble them scientifically. Book burnings. I wanted to sort of quickly pass this idea, but I wanted to point out that, so book burnings, you sort of think of them as this like top-down event, right? But actually it's a bottom-up event. A lot of them are by conservative like student unions in Germany who are rounding up books in the university that they think are that they don't like because they're liberal, or they have what they consider like communist ideals in them, or They run counter to their view of the world, and they're getting these like together and burning them. And then after they've already started doing this, they approach the Nazi Party and say like, hey, do you want to support this? Do you want to send us speakers? Do you want to send us funds and, bands and whatever? So there is Kershaw's concept, right, of working toward the Führer, which is this idea that you just go out and do things that you think Hitler would want done. And that is one way that you are a good and effective Nazi. You don't wait to be told to do something, you just go do it, and it's kind of like sanctioned afterwards. And this is kind of an example of that. But I think it's interesting that it's done not only by university students, and it's kind of like done extracurricularly in an extracurricular manner, but it's done by young people, people who are students at these universities, which, I don't know, in a way makes it extra scary, right? Patron question from Hercules. In episode 2, you mentioned how Judaism can only be measured if you practice Judaism or not, and that's what the Nazis used. Judaism, though, is both a religion and ethnicity, is a classical example of an ethnic religion. I think, but could be wrong, the Nazis primarily went with them as an ethnicity when drafting the Nuremberg laws, not religion, but I could be wrong here. Curious that you clear that up with others. So when I took History of Nazi Germany in college, it was really a great professor, and we did a whole section on this, like the Nazi attempt to define who is Jewish and the Nuremberg laws. And on its face, the Nuremberg laws seem to be based in kind of the ethnic, like the idea of ethnic identification of Judaism. And that, like, there is like an ethnic component to Judaism, like, which is today, like, we have genetics and things like that. But the idea of the Nuremberg laws is having 3 or more Jewish grandparents, makes you Jewish. But then, of course, you take another step back and you're like, how do you define Jewish grandparents? Like, it's synagogue records, it's, names, but names can be quite deceiving, right? My name, Rath, is a very common name in India. Rath, my name is Irish, but when I went to India, people would see my documents and say, like, are you part Indian? Did you have like an Indian ancestor? And I'm like, well, my great-grandfather was born in Hyderabad, but like that was the family name before then, right? So you also get into the situation where people were considered part Jewish, who were still German citizens, who had 1 or 2 parents, Jewish grandparents, were considered German, or were considered they were considered mixed blood, but they were considered citizens unless they practiced Judaism as a religion. So again, like, this seems kind of definitive, but it's actually a very squishy definition with a lot of vagueness to it. And really the determining factor was like practice of Jewish religion, right? So it's one of those things where you drill down, the more you drill down, the more kind of holes in it, because it as a concept is like a little bit on shaky foundations. Patron's question from Jay Rattray. Episode 2 says that those with different bodies are sterilized. Why call it that rather than say disabled? Might sound trivial, but euphemisms are often used by non-disabled people who are uncomfortable with the reality of how disabled people are treated. So I TA'd a class in college about the treatment of the human body through cultural and artistic means throughout time. And one of the things that we discussed was sort of the idea of disabled as a label and why that is sometimes disliked by people in the disability rights community. Because while that label can have utility in like a legal sense, right? You apply for disability because you were unable to do one thing or another. Calling people disabled as a class can feel like defining them by what they can't do rather than what they can do. So we were encouraged in that class because also, we worked on things like disfigurement or like heavy tattooing and things like that. So we kind of like had this term that we used, which was different bodies. Also to acknowledge that like no body is normal, quote unquote. Like I look like I have a quote unquote normal body, but like I have internal organs that are not where they're supposed to be, right? So normality is sort of like kind of a construct in and of itself. So I defaulted to using that language. Maybe it would have been clearer if I had just said disabled, but that's why I made that choice. Patient question, Chromacacid. How widespread were these beliefs? I hear talk of Nazis believed this, but how widespread were these among the rank and file? Individual followers tend to have their own mix of accepted ideals, which can be much more difficult to confront than a single monolith. Yes, absolutely. And we talked about this in episode 5. The vast majority of people in Germany are not giving up Christian beliefs and going all in for, world ice theory and ice moons and, alien panspermia stuff. I would argue that some of these extreme beliefs actually are very, have a sort of blast radius that is much wider than the people who are the hardcore believers at the center, right? So you do have like Himmler and some of these high up Nazis that are really all in like world ice theory, all this stuff. But the example I would use is like UFO culture, right? So in the middle of sort of that ufology circle, you have the people who really organize their lives around this idea of like aliens and government conspiracies and ancient aliens and abductions. A lot of their worldview is shaped by that. Around the outside, you're people who are like, yeah, abductions, government has aliens at Area 51, they're lying. And they're very convinced, but maybe that's not how they see the entire world, but it plays into a major part of their worldview. Outside of that, you have people who are kind of like, yeah, I think there's something going on. Like with the government, I believe that UFOs are aliens, but like, I don't know about this abduction stuff. Then you have like a circle outside of that are like, this sounds like something that like plays into my beliefs, right? I don't really trust the government, but maybe I don't like necessarily believe in alien visitations and cattle mutilations themselves. And then you have a wider like sphere that is like people like me who grew up watching X-Files and are like, I don't believe this stuff, but I think the pop culture value of it is pretty cool. And by the way, I've been rewatching X-Files slowly recently. And I'd forgotten there was a whole anti-vaccine conspiracy thing in there with the smallpox vaccines supposedly being like markers that catalog people. And it's just interesting to go back about that and be like, oh, all right. So I think that's very much the same with this, that maybe you have a lot of people out on the fringes of this that don't necessarily believe like these like central world ice theory things, but are like, I believe that we're superior and there's a reason for that. I don't know, maybe this is like too far, but there's like something that vaguely feels right about it, So I think that some bizarre ideas can be very influential, even if they're not necessarily accepted by a wide part of the culture, because it plays into something that people inherently feel. Now, I'd say the same thing with vaccine conspiracy theories. You have like the 5G microchip kind of people, and then you have the people that are like, I don't know, I'm just a little uncomfortable with how fast the mRNA vaccine was developed, right? So I'm super pro-vaccine, by the way. Like, I should say that. I got my flu vaccine yesterday. A YouTube question. Britain had been actively using their own fighter jets to defend the skies from V-1 rocket strikes at the end of the war, and was the reason the USA started researching jets. As the US Army Air Force saw it was a waste of resources to just keep making better prop planes. Britain's Meteor jet program was on par timeline-wise to Germany's, however, as said in the video, they weren't desperate enough to deploy them over the skies of mainland Europe and risk them getting captured. Yeah, absolutely. And, the only reason that Germany was so ahead on rocket programs, as we talked in our series on the history of spaceflight, is that this was a way to get around the Treaty of Versailles and the restrictions on their Air Force. Like, there are no restrictions on rockets, so we're going to go big on rockets. America had also some really good early rocket research. So did Russia and the Soviet Union, but there wasn't the same amount of sustained investment as Germany. You can go with all this stuff. You hear a lot about like Germany putting in service the first assault rifle, but you don't hear about like almost every American soldier that lands on D-Day has a semi-automatic rifle, which is arguably more impressive than making a couple 100,000 assault weapons, that didn't really make a difference in the end. And every country has these technological achievements, like Poland cracking Enigma, right? What's different with Nazi Germany is that there's this really big propaganda push on these kind of wonder weapons. And then at the end of the war, this sort of gets adopted by Allied pop culture as a way of making German villains and Nazi villains seem more formidable. These Nazis in comic books, like the Red Skull, are doing these like super science things. They sort of get merged with this Victor Frankenstein, because you also have, the Nuremberg trials where they're talking about the scientific experience and stuff like that. So you sort of get this this pop culture mental melding of this idea of German war crimes and science and V1 and things like that. Episode 4. Episode 3 was mostly just comments about the flag. Episode 4, patron question from Bo Carey. Why was Williget sent to a mental health facility? What was he diagnosed with? And what happened after Himmler retired him? Williget was confined in a mental health facility in Salzburg between 1924 and 1927, where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and megalomania. It was actually his wife that called the police on him, because not only was they had a major rift over him claiming to be part of like a line of ancient German god kings, and he wasn't working a lot to support the family, and he was violent at home, and that's what got the police called on him. When Himmler found out about Williget, he quietly retired him due to age, but kind of like kept a line on him to ask about occult questions every once in a while. And he died in 1946 after having a stroke in a refugee camp after the war. Patron question from Flubadubba, condensing this for time, but he was asking whether the research into Proto-Germans in what is now Ukraine was all about like the ancient Aryan kind of stuff versus Goths and Proto-Germans and sort of more historical, prehistorical or historical settlements. It was more the latter. We should have maybe made that more clear. But yeah, I was trying to claim that, this area is part of sort of the historic sphere of influence of German people. So it rightly belonged to Germany. This is actually something that still happens in archaeology, particularly in places like Israel and Palestine, where there'll be some new archaeological site discovered. There'll be a rumor or a worry that like proves, quote unquote, that one group was here first. And people will mob the site and start destroying stuff. This was actually in my archaeology textbook in like a 101 level archaeology course when I was in college, and about how archaeology gets politicized very frequently. And there's also, is the ice moon stuff where the conspiracy theory trope of moon Nazis comes from, or is it just a coincidence? I think it's just a coincidence. Patron question from Corey, did the SS's occult fixation trickle down to the Wehrmacht? I'd largely say no, but go back to our previous conversation about kind of the sort of the blast radius of these things. I think there were probably some people who believed in like world ice theory and ancient Aryan kind of stuff. And there are people who maybe didn't believe that specifically, but were like, the vibe of like us being superior, yeah, that tracks. Another YouTube comment, Scandinavian Arctic. I didn't know about Swedish and Arctic claims before, but it makes more sense than most other countries wanting to be there. We could do a really interesting episode on kind of claims and cooperation in the Arctic. I think that would be very cool. Episode 5, patron question from Bo Carey. Do historians notice the parallels between the extermination of the people of Central Europe by the Nazis and the murder of Native Americans as part of Manifest Destiny, like you mentioned before in a previous series? I think it's difficult to compare one genocide to another, to be perfectly honest. And I think you quickly run into problems. But I think it's more useful to look at it in the context of American attitudes toward the Japanese during World War II and Japanese attitudes towards the Chinese and the Koreans. I think that is kind of a more interesting and often very unsettling comparison, like the way that American soldiers treated and were prompted, and British also, were prompted to treat Japanese soldiers during the Second World War as sort of subhuman and sneaky, and very commonly referring to them as vermin. The War Without Mercy is a really excellent book on this topic. We talk about it a little bit in our series on the Battle of Saipan. But yeah, there are really uncomfortable parallels there with, U.S. soldiers sending Japanese skulls back to their girlfriends and things like that. You know, the harvesting of teeth. If you watch HBO's The Pacific, there's a very, which is very good. There's a part that kind of deals with that. YouTube question, and just a clarification here, we're talking specifically about these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories when we're talking about stuff being baked into government policy. There's absolutely racism baked into American government policy at this time with segregation and Jim Crow laws and miscegenation laws, right? And that's also based on 19th century race science and magical beliefs. I wanted to keep this very specifically about kind of these kind of type of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and ideas of undermining the country, right? If you missed it, we did a really good one-off on the Voting Rights Act right before this series aired. And, you know, it's been rightly pointed out that America's eugenics movement has an effect on Nazi Germany. I would like to do a series on the eugenics movement in the United States. It would be a very upsetting thing to read about, just like this was. But I think it's an important thing to remember. And also, that's one of the reasons we mentioned like the segregated blood supplies during the Second World War. The American Red Cross didn't desegregate blood supplies until 1948. And partially that was because it was just getting too much of a headache to keep track of, frankly. But you have states that do it later. Louisiana only desegregated its blood supplies in 1976. Also on this topic, Charles R. Drew, whose research was the main driver in letting us understand how to extract plasma from blood and reconstitute it, and allowed blood banks to happen and, you know, blood plasma to be used in World War II, was African American. And I'd love to do an episode about him in the future. A few of you said, like, you couldn't believe about the story about Japanese American soldiers and being hunted with dogs. Yeah, this is the Cat Island incident. I would like to do an episode on it. I don't want to go too far into it because it's ripe for us to do more about it. It's a pretty upsetting thing, not just like like involving the treatment of the men that were doing it, but also the treatment of the dogs. Because one of the first problems that they have is the dogs like the Japanese American soldiers and don't see them as enemies. So like they're ordered to start mistreating the dogs so that the dogs, you know, want to go after them. It's really upsetting. I really want to do an episode on that. Coming up on Extra History, the Posse Conspiracy. I've been wanting to do this for a long time. It's one of my wish list topics. We're finally going to do it. It's come out really well. I think you'll be very interested in it. It's a great Renaissance Italy assassination conspiracy involving popes and the Medici brothers and all sorts of great stuff. The Unholy Roman Emperor Frederick II versus the papacy, one of the most dynamic rulers of the Middle Ages, fights with like 4 popes. Interesting guy. And we just got voted through a History of Cats. Really looking forward to starting work on those scripts. Thank you so much for voting. If you want to vote on our future series, head over to our Patreon. Real quick, Ibn Battuta side trip. Pop quiz. Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, what was his favorite 1980s soap opera? Well, that is not actually a weird question. That is a true thing. He lived in life imprisonment in Spanto Prison. By the 1980s, he was very old. He was in his late 80s, early 90s, and his condition started to loosen. One of the things they gave him was they allowed him to watch TV, but he was restricted in the programming. He could watch soccer matches and he could watch a few select soap operas. So his favorite soap operas were Dallas and Dynasty. And this was mind-blowing to me when I learned it, because you just don't think of someone from Nazi high command being alive when I was alive. Like, he died in 1987 at the age of 93 when I was 3 years old. So, like, it really gets you to thinking about, like, this stuff is not that long ago, right? It's in the past, but the past is closer than you think. So I found that fascinating. Thanks very much for tuning in. See you next week for the Posse Conspiracy. See you later.
What if I told you that Angelo Valenciana, Arcalite Games, Dominic Valenciana, Foxdog, Hunter Z, Joseph Blame, Kuyakoya, and Ziliad Architectures were fantastic legendary patrons? Because it's true!